What they didn't tell you. Today, we want to talk about a figure who is very mysterious, but at the same time well known, whether in biblical tradition, Jewish tradition, or in the Qumran texts, such as the famous finds from the Dead Sea Scrolls. In Christianity, however, this figure is practically unknown and often silenced. I'm talking, of course, about Lilith, the biblical, mythical figure, Adam's first wife, an enigmatic woman, often demonized or perhaps even threatening. Basically, we have to say that, in a way, she is also unhappy or mistreated by history. We have discovered several interesting sources, both biblical and extra-biblical, about this figure, about Lilith, the first wife of Adam. So I thought today it would be good to record an episode about her, about this mysterious woman, perhaps the first wife of the first biblical man, Adam. It's worth noting that this figure is well known in contemporary pop culture, as she appears more and more in modern novels, computer games such as Diablo, or series such as Lucifer, and even in anime. For example, in Maya Kosakowska's work, Lilith is an important character. So we have a figure who, on the one hand, is completely unknown and relegated to the margins of ignorance, but on the other hand, in today's culture, is becoming increasingly popular. So let's talk a bit more about Lilith. Who is this ancient biblical and extra-biblical heroine? In the biblical text in the book of Isaiah, chapter 34, which deals with the destruction of the Edomites, I see an error. It should read destruction of the Edomites and not riddle of the Edomites. This is actually a prophetic chapter of Isaiah that describes the destruction of a people considered to be Israel's enemies. The Edomites were ancient enemies of the Israelites and vice versa. So this is a prophetic chapter about destruction, not about a riddle, but about the destruction of Edom. Tell me what you think about this in the comments. We want your opinion. And several interesting things come up here, but I'll leave that aside. From verse 9 onwards, it says that Edom will become a ruin. In other words, there will be nothing left of it. The streams of Edom will turn to pitch, and their dust to sulfur. The land will become like burning pitch. And then it is said that the pelican and the hedgehog will possess it, the owl and the raven will inhabit it, and so on. In other words, this will indicate that it will be a ruin, that there will be no people, and that wild animals will dwell there, that the land will be devastated. And in this great prophecy of Isaiah, in verse 44, our heroine today is mentioned. It says that wild dogs will meet hyenas, referring to what will be left of this devastated land. The goats will call each other. In other words, the animals will dwell there. In addition, Lilith will nest. We have the translation as nest, but it can be interpreted as dwell, that in this remote desert, a destroyed place, Lilith will settle down and find a refuge to rest. So we have a passage from the Bible that says that in the place that will be ruined and become a desert, where wild animals will dwell, will also dwell this figure of ours, the biblical heroine Lilith. We'll soon see where this tradition of associating Lilith with a desert spirit who inhabits these imperfect and inaccessible lands comes from. I still have this chapter, so we can see how other translations present it. We have Yufak Su, Sajimwi Eti Ajim. It's interesting that the animals are named with very similar words. Sajim refers to wild dogs, while Ijim refers to hyenas. In Hebrew, the words are very similar. And then there's our Lilith. The Warsaw Bible translates this as night specter. Also an interesting translation. The Millennium Bible keeps her name Lilith. The Gdansk Bible, on the other hand, has a translation that we really like, Jedza. Incidentally, the Old Reject translation also uses Jedza, referring to her as a witch. So, where does our biblical heroine come from? In fact, Lilith's origins go back to Mesopotamia. Lilu in Akkadian, one of the languages of Mesopotamia, means precisely demonic, i.e. a spirit of the desert. This is an ancient Mesopotamian tradition dating back to, say, 4,000 years ago, where in Sumer, it was believed that these spirits, under the common name of Lilitu, were responsible for deserts and for attacking people, especially men. These spirits had a feminine form and were seen as those who kidnapped young children and attacked babies, an interesting tradition that will later be adopted by Jewish tradition. stating that Lilith primarily attacked women and their newborn babies, and Lilith was considered a demon woman who kidnapped or caused illness in young children. In addition, in Mesopotamian tradition, Lilith is also seen as one who attacks men, being a sexual predator, especially at night when men sleep. They would interpret erotic dreams or have nocturnal pollutions and attribute them to Lilith. This Mesopotamian tradition actually passes into the Bible and Jewish tradition, appearing several times in the Talmud and the Zohar. The Zohar is an important mystical book in Judaism, a mystical commentary on the Torah, and is a fundamental work of Kabbalah. In general, in the Jewish tradition, this figure is widely known, while, as we mentioned in the Christian tradition, he is practically absent. If you like the channel, don't forget to subscribe and like the video to help us grow even more. Now for some sources. In the Alphabet of Ben Sira, which dates from around the 8th century AD, but has roots in much older traditions, including the biblical tradition. This apocryphal work is written in Hebrew and Aramaic in the translation of Drive W. Kozier from the University of Krakow. Let's read the Alphabet of Ben Sira to see how the Jewish, biblical, and post-biblical tradition absorbed the figure of the demonic woman from Mesopotamia. Incidentally, we should remember that in the biblical tradition in the Jewish, Israeli, or Hebrew tradition, we have many motifs taken from Mesopotamia. In many places today, this is already being discussed, whether it's the description of the flood, the description of the creation of the world, the description of Eden. So many of these narratives, especially about the beginnings of the world and creation, are inspired by Mesopotamian culture. In the context of Mesopotamian tradition, Lilith is a feminine symbol. Let's read a passage from this ancient apocryphal text, the Alphabet of Ben Sira, which tells us about our Lilith. It is a paraphrase of Genesis, a commentary that presents the creation of the world and man in parallel. When the Holy One, of course, referring to God, created the first man, he was alone. This refers to Adam. In the Bible, it is written that it is not good for man to be alone. And what do we read next? Then the Holy One said, "It is not good that man should be alone." So he created a woman from the earth, like himself, and named her Lilith. Adam and Lilith immediately began to argue. Lilith said, "I won't stay down." Adam replied, "I won't stay below either, but above, because your place is below and mine is above." What is at issue here? Evidently, it's about the sexual act, where the man is on top and active, while Lilith says she wants to be the opposite. Lilith said, "We are both equal, because we were both created from the earth," and neither of them listened to the other. Before I go any further, I want to explain this text a little, as it reveals many details about the figure of Lilith and her legends. In fact, the dispute between them has a deeper background, involving the struggle for equality. Notice that Lilith is mentioned twice as someone created from the earth, just like Adam, and she goes on to say that they are both equal, made of the same material. This fight about the sexual act is actually a discussion about whether man and woman are equal or whether Adam has the right to subjugate the woman. Lilith, it could be said, did not want to submit to this domination, emphasizing that they were both created from the earth. Here we have a reference to biblical tradition. Before we go any further and read more of the Ben Sira alphabet, let's return briefly to the Bible, to the narrative of the creation of the world. Some argue that in the biblical narrative we find echoes of the legend of Lilith. It is true that the biblical text in Genesis does not mention Lilith. I've already mentioned my astonishment when the rabbis started talking about her. But in the narrative of the creation of man, we'll see in the second chapter. We can start with the first chapter of Genesis, which says that the first man and woman were created simultaneously without being named as equals. In verse 27 of the first chapter of Genesis we read, "And God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Is and Issa, man and woman. Zakar and Nequa." God created man and woman. Only in the second chapter, which is the so-called non-priestly text, is it said that when God formed man from the earth, he shaped only Adam. Here it is written that he formed only man. Then we read that when this man felt alone, it's not good for man to be alone. God caused a man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he slept, he removed one of his ribs, filled the place with flesh, and from this rib formed a woman. This woman was called Eve. Notice that we have a passage that says, "This is now bone of my bones." Some scholars, as interpreted in the ancient Midrash Bereshit Rabbah, believe that the word now refers to the fact that this is the second woman. The ancient rabbis interpret this exaltation of Adam as a reference to the second wife, who is Eve, the first from the first chapter, who was created at the same time as Adam, would be the biblical Lilith. Of course, this is a later interpretation. The usual reading is that there are two different narratives, the priestly and the non-priestly, referring to the same event, the same theological truth, the creation of man. In Mesopotamian tradition, Lilith is a fascinating figure. Let's take a look at an excerpt from an ancient text called the Alphabet of Ben Sira. It talks about Lilith in a way reminiscent of the creation story in Genesis. When God created the first man, Adam, he was alone. In the Bible, it is written that it is not good for man to be alone. So God decided to create a woman from the earth, just like Adam, and named her Lilith. But they soon started arguing. Lilith said, "I won't stay down." Adam replied, "I'm not going down either, because I belong up there." This fight wasn't just about positions, but about equality. Lilith wanted to be seen as equal to Adam, because they were both made from the same earth. She insisted, "We are equal," but neither seemed to listen to the other. This discussion shows that Lilith didn't want to submit, pointing out that they were created together. It's interesting to note that the Bible doesn't mention Lilith directly. However, in the narrative of Genesis, we find clues that could relate to her. In the first chapter, the Bible says that God created man and woman at the same time, as equals. But in the second chapter, it only talks about the creation of Adam, where he felt lonely. God made him sleep, and while he was like that, he took out a rib and created Eve. Some scholars believe that this reference to Eve may suggest that she is the second woman, while Lilith was the first, created before her. This is an interpretation that emerged later. Many people see these stories as different narratives about the same creation. There are two different stories about the creation of Adam and Eve, and it is interesting to see how each one conveys a unique message. Instead of thinking that one happened after the other, we can imagine that there are two versions of the same story, like the four Gospels that talk about Jesus. Each one has its own way of telling the story, and this enriches our understanding. An ancient text called the Midrash Bereshit Rabbah gives us insight into the creation of Eve. It says that Eve was made from Adam's rib, and this is quite different from how Adam was created, which was from the earth. When we think about this, we see that Eve was not created at the same time as Adam, and this can change how we understand her. Some believe that this difference made her submissive to Adam. In the view of some people, Eve was there to help Adam, but she didn't question what he said. This idea of submission was common in ancient patriarchal society, where men were seen as the heads of the household. Now, let's talk about Lilith. She appears in the Alphabet of Ben Sira as a strong and independent woman. When Lilith and Adam began to argue, she made it very clear that she wanted to be seen as his equal. To Lilith, it didn't make sense for one to be above the other, as both were created from the same earth. Their argument wasn't just about where each should stand, but about equality and respect. Lilith was one of the first to fight for this, challenging the idea that she should submit. In a decisive moment of their argument, Lilith spoke the secret name of God, a name considered sacred and powerful. This was seen as a great transgression, because in ancient times, uttering this name meant being in direct contact with God. When Lilith did this, the story goes that her wings grew, and she was able to fly away from Adam. This act symbolizes her quest for freedom and autonomy. Adam, realizing that Lilith had fled, felt lost and prayed to God, saying, "Lord, the woman you gave me has fled from me." God then sent 3 angels after her. These angels may remind us of the archangels we know, like Michael and Gabriel, who are sent to help in times of need. The story doesn't specify exactly where Lilith went, but various ancient traditions claim that she fled to the vicinity of the Red Sea. This place, according to some legends, was seen as a home for demons and malevolent forces. In the book of Jonah, for example, the sea is mentioned as a space of dangerous and confusing waters. Jonah speaks of how these waters surrounded him, creating an image of danger and mystery. Thus, the Red Sea appears as a symbol of unknown places where hidden forces might dwell. The story of Lilith leads us to reflect on important themes such as freedom and equality. She represents the struggle of many women throughout history who sought their place and voice in a world that often tries to silence them. Lilith invites us to think about what it means to be strong and independent. What do you think of all this? How do you view the fight for equality today? In the book of Jonah, this is also somehow related to that place of wickedness. Lilith flees there. The Lord God sends 3 angels after her, and it is said, to bring her back. God also said, it's better if she chooses to return. If not, she will have to bear the responsibility for the death of her children. Each day, 100 of them will die. Here I need to add an ancient tradition that had already emerged in Mesopotamia and was incorporated into both the biblical and Jewish traditions. That is, Lilith is also considered a symbol of female sexuality. The woman who, in fact, this first dialogue speaks about that. The first dialogue focuses on sexual position. Should the man be on top be the active one? Or can the woman be on top be active? This was already seen as something that crossed boundaries and limits, right? We are talking about the classic missionary position. In other words, how sexual relations were supposed to be, and no other way. Since antiquity, Lilith has been seen as a symbol of female sexuality, even liberated sexuality, which, of course, was somewhat threatening and difficult to control for men. Because of this, according to ancient tradition, Lilith has many children. In some stories, it is said that Lilith gives birth to 100 children a day. And here is where God's punishment comes in, that if Lilith does not return, she will be held responsible for the death of her children, meaning that 100 of them will die each day. This tradition in the Alphabet of Ben Sira references the legend that Lilith, as a sexually promiscuous woman seducing men, would give birth to 100 children a day. Of course, it's hard to physically imagine a woman giving birth to 100 children daily, but obviously, in legends and tales, anything is possible. Let's continue. The angels, as commanded by God, went after her and found her in the deep sea, amidst the tumultuous waters, where the Egyptians would die. As I said, these are the waters of the Sea of Reeds, the waters of the Red Sea. There, they found her. They repeated God's divine words. However, she didn't want to return. They threatened her. We will drown you in the sea. That is, notice, they even threatened her to make her return. They threatened her with God's command, even saying that her children would die. They even threatened her own death to make her return and submit to Adam. This woman does not want to. And that's why Lilith, as I say, is sometimes considered a symbol of the liberated woman, who, even at the cost of death, refuses to submit to Adam's dominion. Additionally, Adam is portrayed in this apocryphal text somewhat sarcastically as a man who cannot handle the situation, a bit satirical. In general, men here are depicted quite sarcastically, and the woman is presented as one who defends herself from submission to the man. She responded to the angels, "Leave me alone. I wasn't created to torment newborns with sickness and weakness. From birth until the 8th day, I will have power over them, if they are boys, and from birth until the 20th day, if they are girls." And here again, we have a reference to a very important tradition that already emerged in Mesopotamia, in the sources of this legend about Lilith, and later appears in the biblical tradition, that Lilith is responsible for kidnapping or causing illness in babies, especially in the early moments right after birth. And here, it's important to note that Lilith took on a very difficult role, which was to explain a common phenomenon in antiquity, which is a high infant and neonatal mortality. In antiquity, there wasn't the advanced medicine and science that we have today, so child mortality was very high. And we know that, in antiquity, Having children was considered a blessing from God. It was a great divine gift. Having children, fertility, descendants, was very important. Therefore, the ancients tried to explain this. So, how is it? On one hand, God wants us to have children. He wants us to have these babies. And on the other hand, there's high neonatal mortality. You could say that Lilith assumes an ungrateful role, one that should be directed toward both men and God, a role of responsibility for the high infant mortality. Therefore, the ancients simply attributed this mortality to demons, thus to the demon Lilith. Lilith, by rebelling against Adam, was banished to the land of demons and, in that way, became, to some extent, a demonic woman. And it is she who lurks after newborns. She kidnaps these children, causes weakness in them, inflicts diseases, either kidnaps or devours them. There's even a tradition that she devours these children. In general, this explains the high neonatal mortality in antiquity. This mortality was attributed to this female demon Lilith. Lilith takes on this very difficult role of being responsible for the deaths of babies, as she lurks after women who have just given birth. And Lilith is there to kidnap these children. There's also an interesting tradition that says Lilith's own children, the ones she gave birth to, as we mentioned above, died. Here it is said that as punishment, her children will die. In other words, Lilith, in this tradition, is jealous. She herself cannot have children. Her children die. Therefore, she, as a demon, a demonic woman, kidnaps the children of other women. And now, how can one protect against this? How did the ancients discover ways to protect their newborns from the demon Lilith? For this situation, let's continue. The angels, after hearing her words, insisted on taking her. However, she made a vow to them in the name of the living and true God. That is, here Lilith provides a way out, a response, a solution for how people should deal with the situation of having small children, newborns. Whenever I see you, your names, or your figures on an amulet, I will not be able to dominate the child protected by this amulet. She also took responsibility for the death of her children. We read that earlier. And now, an etiology. In the end, we have the explanation of this legend or the situation. That's why the names of the angels are written on the amulet belonging to small children. When Lilith sees them, she remembers her vow, and the child is healed. And the child is healed. Of course, this story from the Alphabet of Ben Sira extends into late antiquity, but its roots are much, much older. It really explains this phenomenon that in antiquity, but especially in the Middle Ages, was very common. That is, this magical thinking. For example, some medallion or amulet will protect me, will protect the person from being dominated by an evil spirit. This kind of thinking was widely present, especially in Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism is strongly surrounded by amulets. Even Orthodox rabbis crafted these amulets, as they had specific knowledge and interpretations. This practice dates back to the legend of Lilith, which explains the ancient medieval or even earlier custom of giving children an amulet with the names of angels meant to protect them from death, or, in other words, to prevent them from being taken symbolically by Lilith. Lilith actually represents various human fears, such as the fear for children's lives. She also symbolizes men's fear of a liberated and independent woman. In ancient times, the role of women was defined differently, and Lilith clearly crossed those boundaries established for women of that era. In a way, she is a symbol of masculine fears, as it is said that she or demons born from her haunt men at night, causing, for example, nocturnal emissions. There was a need to explain why men had erections or ejaculated during the night, and this was attributed to Lilith. Let's look at some representations of our enigmatic heroine. On the one hand, in Mesopotamia, she was portrayed as a demonic figure. On the other, she was depicted as a beautiful woman. So, we have two sides, the beautiful woman and the threatening figure. An interesting representation of Lilith in ancient Jewish tradition says that she was responsible for seducing Eve, the second wife of Adam, her rival, so to speak. There is a tradition that claims she married Samuel, the angel of death, and together with this demon, seduced the first parents Adam and Eve in Eden. This legend tells us that Lilith participated in the temptation in paradise. Here, we have a more modern representation of Lilith as a woman with a threatening appearance. The image of Adam and Eve being seduced not by the classic serpent, but by Lilith the woman. In ancient Mesopotamia, we find the roots of this legend about the female demon Lilith. Some researchers suggest that a sculpture represented this goddess or female demon, although, in fact, this image is more of an icon of Inanna, who in Babylonian mythology is known as Ishtar. I mentioned this figure when analyzing the work of Gilgamesh. It is worth noting that Lilith, the female demon, was considered a servant or helper of Inanna, leading some scholars to conclude that this sculpture represents the seductive and somewhat demonic Lilith. In some representations, she is depicted as a woman with wings. In a text by Ben Sira, it is said that upon uttering the sacred name of God, she gains the ability to fly, transforming into a being that is part angel, part demon, often represented with wings. There is an interesting legend about Lilith that even reached a papal bull. According to tradition, Lilith either bore demons alone or, in relation to Samuel, was considered the mother of demons. These demons were known as succubi and incubi. The subject is vast, and I might record an episode on this later. In general, Lilith is believed to have given birth to these demonic creatures. Succubi are female demons who seduce men, appearing at night as beautiful women or young women with feminine appearances. These succubi seduce innocent men, leading them to immoral acts. Pope Innocent VIII, in one of his bulls, mentioned that it had come to his knowledge that in some northern German provinces, people of both sexes, disregarding the salvation of their souls and the Catholic faith, engaged in promiscuity with demons, incubi, and succubi. It's interesting to note that during the Middle Ages, women faced even more challenges. Not only were Lilith's offspring seen as demonic, but even a woman with red hair was suspected of being a child of Lilith. Many women caught in adultery were considered daughters of Lilith, with devastating consequences for them. Thus, what is deeply rooted in us, our instincts, desires, fears, and weaknesses, is often attributed to external beings. The incubi and succubi, who according to tradition are Lilith's offspring, are these beings who attack people. In summary, the figure of Lilith appears from ancient times, with roots in Sumerian culture in Mesopotamia, as a demonic and threatening woman. This tradition was incorporated into the Bible and related literature, further developed over time, especially in texts about creation, where she is mentioned as Adam's first wife. She represents a woman who refuses to submit to the Patriarchy, who utters God's name, and becomes a demon, blamed for various misfortunes. In Christian tradition, she is associated with figures like Lamia, a Greek equivalent, as per Jerome's translation of the Vulgate. It's curious to note that many cultures share this theme, from Mesopotamian to Hebrew. The figure of Lamia appears as a pattern or kind of female demon that devoured the children of young men, especially attacking women who gave birth to these young ones. At its core, this serves to explain phenomena that we now consider natural, such as infant mortality and nocturnal emissions in young men, among other sexual tensions. Lamia was a sexually predatory woman, helping to explain these situations. Jerome translates this figure as Lamia. Interestingly, in Slavic culture, we also have similar figures, like the female demon Mamuna and the Straziga, who also attack men. This shows that this topic is common in various literatures, be it Mesopotamian, Hebrew, around the Bible, Greek, or Slavic. This shows that men in ancient times had difficulties with emancipated women. This did not fit the standards and stereotypes of the time. Often, these women were attributed demonic traits. I think that's enough for now about our Lilith. It's important to remember, as I mentioned at the beginning, that she is a figure both mysterious and, on the other hand, demonic and enigmatic, even appearing threatening. However, one might say she is a somewhat tragic and sad figure, as treated by her first husband in history. She ended up becoming an archetype of the female demon.